In this video, we'll turn our attention to the westward expansion of America from the late 1830s through the 1850s. It was a period when Americans saw their nation spreading from coast to coast, and it was a sentiment that a newspaperman coined as manifest destiny, and that became a well-known phrase. The idea was that America's unique. It's not a monarchy. It's a democracy, and the land's unclaimed, and sort of it's our national destiny to go coast to coast, and it's something that God intended. It's we're a freedom-loving Christian people, and God intended us to spread across the land. Here you see the image of Lady Liberty leading the pioneers westward. Anyway, in this video here, we're going to look at the individual efforts of people to get west. Of course, with Jefferson having sent Lewis and Clark expedition along the Missouri River and into the Columbia River Basin, claiming all of that territory for the United States, it's not surprising that the Oregon Territory was an area that America saw as its own. Further south, it was first Spanish territory and then Mexican territory, but Oregon was still in contention. And Oregon was really attractive. In the 1830s, the government sent another expedition out there, and they reported back that the Willamette Valley was, quote, one of the most beautiful, fertile, and extensive valleys in the world. Wheat, corn, and tobacco country. If our government ever intends on taking possession of Oregon, the sooner it shall be done, the better. By 1840, a traveler reported that 120 American farms existed in Willamette Valley, populated by 500 settlers, pasturing 3,000 cattle, 2,500 horses, and, quote, an infinite number of hogs, unquote. The Willamette Valley, you can see on the right here, just great farmland, and it also provided access to the Columbia River Basin, and therefore, as Lewis and Clark knew, and that's easy transportation to the Pacific. So this is a very valuable area, an area that Manifest Destiny is going to be focused on. Now, another destination for Manifest Destiny, westward expansion, was, of course, California, which was a little more contentious since it had been Spanish territory, and the Mexicans started rebelling in 1810, and by 1821, they had gained all that for their independence. So it was Mexican territory, and Americans, however, still wanted to migrate there. It had a moderate climate, and there was a lot of rich farmland in this Central Valley, still is today. And of course, there was the great port of San Francisco area, and again, that was easy access to the ocean and to trade. California was booming for Mexico, and part of that was because of the new and faster clipper ships, and they allowed quicker and easier access and trade across the Pacific Ocean. It was now you could cross the easier ocean, the big wide Pacific Ocean, much wider than the Atlantic, quicker. Travelers westward in the 1840s would travel together along established routes across the Great Plains and over the Rocky Mountains. They traveled together for the obvious reason of protection. They still used the Conestoga wagon, which had been developed previously as sort of freight wagons, and the body of the wagon slanted upward at each end to prevent contents from falling out. But it was it's a good vehicle. A single wagon could carry up to 5 tons in cargo, depending, of course, on the number of draft animals that were pulling it. And they called these the prairie schooners, at least when people started heading out across the Great Plains. They thought the Conestoga wagon was perfectly suited. These pioneers were not just men, adventurers like earlier. They were entire families, and they would try to leave on their journey in the spring, and that would allow them to go as fast as they can to get over the Rocky Mountains before the winter snows hit. The weather was more than just a challenge in the Rocky Mountains. It could be a challenge anytime. And the trip, of course, was dangerous for other reasons, mainly Indian attacks. When the Indians attacked, the pioneers would circle their wagons for protection, as you can see in this picture here. As the word of early settlers drifted out and more people began to travel westward, they would follow the markings of people that went before them. And an established route to Oregon began to be called the Oregon Trail. In 1843, 1,000 immigrants traveled it, and by 1845, it was up to 3,000. And by 1852, over 10,000 people. There had already been a trail, a commercial trail to the Mexican Commerce Center of Santa Fe moving southwest. The Oregon Trail went northwest and went through the South Pass of the Rocky Mountains. West of the South Pass, the major trail split as some went to the northwest continuing on the Oregon Trail, while others went southwest along what became known as the California Trail. The California Trail ended at Sutter's Fort, which is now Sacramento, California, and that has easy access from there to the Bay Area. When they began early on, many left from the city of St. Louis. That's not surprising. That was where Lewis and Clark had departed from, and other early explorers. For that reason, St. Louis is sort of considered the gateway to the West, and that's why they built that St. Louis Arch, which you can see here. Perhaps you've been there. But by the 1840s, Missouri was starting to be developed pretty well, and people would depart from a town further west, which was Independence, Missouri, was the new departing area. The first few days were okay. The plains were flat, and the path was generally easy to follow. It was well marked, and everybody was fresh and excited, and you could make as many as 20 miles a day. At the end of the second day, about 40 miles west of Independence, a signpost directed them to the road to Oregon. Others would split off at this point and travel that Santa Fe Trail southwest to the city of Santa Fe. From this point, it took about 3 weeks to travel the 350 miles across the flat plains until they reached Fort Laramie. As the Oregon Trail grew in popularity, the U.S. government tried to maintain these forts, sort of aid and protect the migrants. And the reality was, however, that the settlers probably are put more at risk by these forts because the Indians saw them as something permanent. After Fort Laramie, it was about 100 miles until the migrants started climbing into the mountain country. They'd often find that their Conestoga wagon wasn't going to make it, wasn't going to cut it after it'd been great for a while but didn't last. And they'd have to lighten their load by selling or simply dumping heavy items. One report of the trail debris told of, quote, bar iron and steel, large blacksmith anvils and bellows, crowbars, drills, augers, gold washers, chisels, axes, lead, trunks, spades, plows, large grindstones, baking ovens, cooking stoves, kegs, barrels, and clothing, all left behind. If traders were there, they might trade animals for fresh ones, and everyone, of course, stocked up on the food they'll need: bacon, beans, and coffee. If a trader was there, and obviously the traders would pick up on what had been left behind. The next marker was Independence Rock in what's now central Wyoming, 838 miles west, and a landmark towards the South Pass. Many migrants inscribed their names on a rock that became known as the Register of the Desert. You can see some of that graffiti on the right here, and the Independence Rock today, which is a state park on the left. About 70 miles west of Independence Rock, they reached the South Pass, and this carried them over the Continental Divide at about 7,500 feet altitude. From this point on, they went 123 miles to Fort Bridger, where cavalry patrols and military escorts might be available to some of the lucky trail parties. In time, federal efforts would try to develop the trail, At first, if you're lucky, all you got were local private entrepreneurs charging for ferry rides across rivers, and of course they're often ripping people off. They have a monopoly. Bottlenecks of pioneers would back up for several days, trying waiting to be allowed to use the ferry across the river. Several hundred miles west, now about 1,300 miles or so from Independence where they'd started, they came to Fort Hall, which is on the Snake River. Originally, it had been a British fort. From here, the migrants could head southwest on the California Trail over the Sierra Nevada mountains to Sutter's Fort if they wanted. So Fort Hall was an important location, and you could again get traders there as the migrants split to California and Oregon. The Oregon Trail migrants would roughly then follow the Snake River until they reached the Columbia River, which, if they wanted, took them to a terminus in what's now Portland, Oregon. That was about 2,000 miles from Independence where they'd begun, but it took them right through the Willamette Valley. If you went southwest on the California Trail, you had a little bit rougher go from that point on because you had to get into Sierra Nevada mountains. And the time has passed since you left, and if you left late or you were slowed down, you might not make it across the Sierra Nevada mountains to Sutter's Fort before the first snowfall. And that was the case with the infamous Donner Party in 1846 and 1847. These settlers were caught in huge snowdrifts, and they started starving, and they actually resulted to cannibalism. A number of them died. Anyway, this concludes the video on the individual settlers and how they traveled westward as part of Manifest Destiny.